I do think it's funny. Bushi pulled a Brock Lesnar here. He said, if he's gone, I'm gone. He's like, Naito's gone. There's no reason. If I'm not going to be taking pinfalls for Naito, there's no reason. I got chicken money waiting for me. Like, I'm good. So, Bushi's gone. And I'm sure you guys will elaborate a lot more than I will on this, but Naito is pretty easily in my book from the last probably at least 12 years, the biggest draw in the company that the company's had over that time frame. From a merch sales standpoint, from a attendance and live gate standpoint, and just general eyes on the product, especially domestically, it's a big blow. It's not quite the same thing as when Okada left, but it's in some ways potentially even more impactful from a business standpoint. So, there's that to sort of think about. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, I know there was something else I wanted to talk about. Oh, yeah. So I do think it's interesting. We've been getting questions. No. Okay. I have two things I want to say. One thing, I've had people jumping into my DMs, and there's probably a few people listening. They think that it's just them, but it's not. I've had like multiple people over the past few weeks jumping into my DMs based on comments that I've made on this show and in our Discord, assuming that I know that there is something going on with Naito behind the scenes. But I haven't known shit. I haven't talked to anybody. I just like to talk shit all the time. And they have almost like they've thought that I've been inferring, hidden meaning or like knowledge about the ongoings of like Naito's contract status. And what that tells me is I think that there's a lot more people who've known, like, from the fandom under, like, there's been rumors going on and people have been talking about this in a way that maybe even me and Jeremy didn't know about, because people are coming to me and like, what do you know? And I'm like, I don't know shit. If I knew it, I would just said it on the air like an idiot. You guys would have heard me say it, but
and it's funny. It's been like week after week. We're done with LIJ. Get Naito and Tanahashi out of here. Like, you've made a lot of comments.
I've talked about it.
Naito leaving,
but it's because he's on his last leg from a health standpoint, and it's been painful to watch him wrestle. So, but I didn't actually think he was leaving. So we've been getting those comments. And then the last thing before I kick it to you guys is, for many years now, we've had people asking us questions. When do you think XYZ wrestler is going to become a dad? When do you think this person's when's the transition going to happen? And there's been this belief from like the fan base that at some point in the near future that a lot of these stars would transition to a more supportive role. And I've said this for many years now, and I believe it's finally come to pass, that these guys are never going to become dads. And it's played out true. Like, Ibushi's gone, Tanahashi's leaving, Naito's gone, Okada's gone. And in the past, if you track the history of New Japan, the top stars who are actual stars, who drew money, who were big deals, they just leave. They don't transition. Only the third generation did that. And that's because they were on top at a time frame when the company was at its lowest. And then they caught the wave, the trajectory of when the company came back from a business standpoint. They were able to transition into a healthy role and kind of keep supporting and become dads. But like, you look at the old history of like New Japan, like Muto never did that shit. Fujinami never did that shit. Like Hashimoto, like Kensuke Sasaki, these guys didn't stick around. They all still had, Tiger Mask, they all had options to continue to thrive and be top stars outside in other ventures, and parlayed that into lucrative opportunities. And then at some point in the future, all eventually, like, Ricky Choshu and those guys, they all came back and assumed a more senior status. That's what I think we're going to see here with Naito. I think Naito he's got the world in front of him right now from a opportunity standpoint. I know a lot of people only see it from the spectrum of like, well, is he going to AEW or WWE? Because that's all he can do. And it's like, well, no, he was either going to get cycled down here, or he can open things up creatively. And he's got Noah, he's got All Japan, he's got Big Japan, he's got GLEAT, he's got all of the Japanese indies and territories. He can do produce shows. He's got tons of first-time matches that he's never done before. He can freelance and do it at his own pace and work big matches. And he can still come back to New Japan and work dome shows and work on top and avoid the G1 and the rigors of their house show tour. Plus, he can go to the UK. Plus, he can go to the US and work indie dates and work WrestleMania weekends and, do Joey Janela spring break and, maybe even pop up in AEW and work a date or two here or there. Like, the world is kind of his oyster as long as his knees hold together and as long as he doesn't lose his eyesight. Like, Naito's going to be fine. It's New Japan that I'm worried about in this in this situation. What are your guys' thoughts?
Go ahead, Fraser.
Well, I'd say one thing that I think it's a slightly different take on Josh, but the same outcome, which is this week in between point. I think the key thing that's happened since the news came out and when we're recording is the Korakuen show happened, right? And that was the first vibe check. And that was a very strange maybe the wrong word, maybe unique show for so many reasons. One, it was a road to show, which is normally boring, but you had one other big story that I'm sure you'll get to later. Plus, you had the first appearance since the news broke of Naito and Bushi leaving, which happened to be their last appearance ever under this contractual structure with New Japan. It started at 11:30 in the morning because Rise had booked Korakuen at night. So this is why I'm doing a podcast first thing in the morning. That's kind of weird as well. But that was I was fascinated. I didn't have a ticket for that show originally. And then when the news came out, bang, everyone went straight to the ticket sites and bought them as quickly as possible. And standing room only, people there queuing from 10 a.m. in the morning. But I think there's quite a few things I'd say. I'll try to run through them very quickly. The first thing I would say is for anyone listening and anyone who happens to be on this podcast who hasn't already done it, make sure you watch this week's backstage comments. The wrestlers themselves, and not just the obvious candidates of Naito, Bushi, and their opponents, but every single wrestler talked about it. And I think Naito's a bit of a different cat. I mean, I don't pretend to know where he's going or what he's doing or whatever, but he always said to that dad point, he was always very vocal, said, I'm never going to do that. When it's time to go, it's time to go. And to be frank, I was there live, and I'm never one to climb on people not being at top of their game, and he's 42 and he's been wrestling, like it seems, every day for the last however many years or whatever. But when you're live, you can really pick up on stuff. And on TV, like when he squared off against Taichi at the end of that match, you could kind of see maybe why on both sides of the fence. Maybe it was time to have a break, right? If I put it nicely. And I could see him when he went for that tornado DDT against Taichi. I was on the north side, which is behind the ring. So the hard camera's kind of looking into you. So he was looking straight towards me. You could say, well, not straight towards me, but in my direction. And he was only a meter or two away from the top rope to go and do his tornado DDT. I see him like squinting, like, where the hell is the rope kind of thing. I thought, man, there's a word in Japanese. It's called karoshi, which is to work yourself to death. If that was ever going to happen in wrestling, well, it probably has. But if it was ever to happen again, Naito would be a prime candidate for that. So I think his situation is a little bit different. Fan-wise, it's going to have a massive impact. I talked to a couple of, because I'm sure US is probably the same, but in Japan, a lot of J fans, they have their favorite and they're a live gate company at the end of the day. So they crucially depend on that merch sales, and bang, Naito is kind of top of the pile for both of those, right? And I spoke to two fans after the show who were Naito fans. One of them was a lady who was going to go to every G1 show bar 2. And when that news came out, she's going to like 7 or something. And people might just say, oh, that's no big deal. 7 G1 shows is not a bad outcome, which I agree with. But, it's just a simple example. I spoke to another guy who's been to 5 complete tours of the G1. He's not going this year. Instead, what he did was he bought every ticket for every Road to show and Dontaku itself instead, to make sure he sees every single last performance of Naito. So I kind of think, like, I agree with Josh's point. You've got to be a bit worried about New Japan. Back to backstage comments. A lot of the senior wrestlers, like the dads, as we say, who've kind of seen everything over the last 30 years, a lot of them sort of say, well, we're really disappointed with this outcome. I mean, if you're struggling for time, I'd recommend 3 interviews outside the obvious. One is Taichi, one is Honma, and one is Nagata. Those 3 are definitely worth watching. And all of them They sort of say, well, it's not ideal, Naito maybe, and the office couldn't agree. And I mean, you don't really need to do the maths to figure out what they're arguing about. So that was quite telling. And then Bushi is an interesting one. He kind of gets a bit lost, as Josh's joke sort of shows that, you know, with Naito going, everyone forgets about Bushi. I think, because I listened to the English commentary when I got home out of curiosity about it, and he was announced for the Best of Super Juniors, right, 11 days beforehand.
Yep.
And the way Charlton was talking was as if maybe, well, Naito hadn't agreed to anything yet. Perhaps not. Bushi had. I don't know. I don't pretend to know anything, but that was the gist of it. And there was some, and generally speaking, Japanese don't complain publicly. You know, it's all part of their manner system. But there were a few Japanese on Twitter, and that's where I go for a lot of my sort of how do fans feel about stuff. And a couple came out and said, this is very unprofessional of Bushi. He's contractually agreed to Best of Super Juniors. I bought tickets on this basis. He's not injured. There's no reason he can't perform in these things. What's going on? So there's been a slight dynamic as well. But then in typical Japanese fashion, anybody who speaks out gets hammered down. How dare you criticize one of our beloved wrestlers? So I think, it's fascinating. But the one thing to finish with is I'd say Korakuen for me, and I could be totally wrong, in the future we'll see, marks not the new era, but it is the era now, right? Naito's gone. There's no more discussion about, you know, when is the time for X and Y. You've got your answer by default, if you like, which, who knows, might be a good thing. But highly recommend Nagata, Honma, Taichi. Make sure you listen to those backstage comments.
Yeah, and I know, Josh, you were joking with the whole, like, you know, the Brock Lesnar bit with Bushi, but I mean, that does seem that's like what happened, and it's very different in the statements like we're seeing here. You know, there seems to be there was a lot of back and forth with Naito in the office on kind of what it was, kind of tour by tour kind of basis, where Bushi, yeah, he was locked in, set for the tournament, and then he essentially quit, whereas Naito is just not signing a new contract. His contract was already up and he's working tour by tour. So yeah, definitely I could see why their fans could be upset about that, and maybe the office, you know, might not be so happy in the way Bushi left, but it does seem like there's they're not completely upset about the way Naito has left, with just kind of working tour by tour. And I think it's, again, like you mentioned, Josh, maybe something we probably should have seen coming. We've been seeing stories year after year, especially after COVID, of top stars like Naito taking pay cuts to help the company out. And then even last month, or actually beginning of this month, on April Fool's Day, there was a Tokyo Sports article that came out with their headline of, you know, Naito in danger of leaving New Japan. And all of us, all the, you know, American podcasters, we kind of laugh at that. A, it was April Fool's Day. B, it's Naito talking to Tokyo Sports. It's like, oh, it's Naito. He's doing his thing. He's, you know, messing with the media like he always does. So, like, I totally just wrote that off, didn't think anything about it. And then when I wake up, you know, in the middle of the morning, take my dog out, and I see this news, I couldn't believe it. It's as shocking as Okada leaving. Go ahead.
I will say I was not on the episode where the speculation occurred. That was the week where I was out sick and you had MJ on, and I was listening, and I was like, there was a part of me when I was listening to you guys, I'm like, they're probably right, but I had heard that he definitely did not have a contract. And I was like, fuck, I wish I was on this week's episode so I could throw that in there, because what if? Because it is 2025 and a lot of crazy departures have happened the past few years. You just never know. And you know, it never really came back up. And then here we are a few weeks later, and it's like, but I always thought that there would be a resolution. You know what I mean? I did think that something somewhere would be worked out to where they would work to keep Naito, just knowing how important he is to. I actually feel like for Naito, it's a good thing. We've been talking about how, like, he needs time off. He needs to take a break. He needs to take care of his health. Things are falling apart at the seams for him physically, but you know, the company, thankfully for them, in this like first or, you know, second quarter of the year, they've caught on to the Goto train, and like the Goto numbers have been just beyond belief. Like I don't think anyone really expected for them to be performing the way that they're doing under his tenure, with a lot of it being directly attributed to his role as champion and the bumps and the boosts that they've seen coming out of that. But now then you turn around and you take away Naito, who's, you know, for year in and year out pretty much been their primary draw, especially in the wake of, you know, Jay White left, Okada left, Will Ospreay left, you know, before that Kenny Omega, Ibushi, Nakamura, you know, it's been one, AJ Styles, it's been like one after another. Big stars have been leaving, and he's been like, aside from, you know, Tanahashi, who's also leaving at the end of this year, the one constant and the one big, you know, merchandise mover, the one big draw that they can always count on. And now he's gone. And I don't know, who knows? Like, maybe if it is just a money issue, maybe something changes and this could be a temporary measure. And who's to say he doesn't re-sign with the company? But we've always had these concerns about his health when it comes to his knees and it comes to the health of his eyes. So who knows?
Yeah. Jeremy, if you don't mind, I just say a couple of final comments on it from my perspective.
Go ahead.
One, and Josh has kind of touched on this, purely as a human being, I think it's time for Naito to have a rest. So I kind of hope, and I'm not, you know, good luck for him if he gets a huge contract somewhere else, if that's what he wants, by all means. But I would just say time to have a rest. My gut feel is, and I'm not doing any coded stuff here, is that Naito being Naito, I don't see him going off. All those names that rattled off before were guys that either WWE or AEW sent the bag to, so to speak, right? I could easily see Naito going in a different direction, which you could take positively and negatively from a New Japan perspective. The third thing I'd say is I left off one amusing backstage comment you definitely have to watch, which is Hiromu talking to Okamoto, who's a Tokyo sports guy who Naito always messes around with. There's a very good segment there. The last thing I'd say, just on live tickets, which ultimately drive the revenue of the company and therefore what they can pay their wrestlers. People like to be positive and kind of say there's a bit of a bump and a boost, but in reality, pretty much since COVID, it's been, you can spin it slightly differently, but give or take, it hasn't moved massively around, right? We're off the worst of it, but by no means are we in fantasy land. So we're kind of going sideways before this news came out. And I know from speaking to fans directly, he will have an impact on losing. But, you know, change breeds opportunity, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's going to be a very fascinating time for New Japan, as was the Korakuen show itself.
You got to be careful there, Fraser, when you talk about New Japan not having recovered after the pandemic, because I made this exact point on Twitter. Yeah. You know, I think it was even a year or two ago, and people were like, what is he talking about? They're like, they're doing numbers. And I'm like, they're not. They have never recovered.
Dude, I've been to like live shows for the last 10 years, like pretty much every single live show. I don't give a shit what's on the internet for whatever numbers they are. I can remember how crowded venues were versus what they are today. And in both a good and a bad way, the fans I see at big shows, and Korakuen Road 2, ironically, was a big show for two reasons, one of which we're talking about now. The problem is, it's a good thing and a bad thing. You've got some very loyal fans who pretty much go to all shows, and I'm loosely one of them. But there's also a bad thing because there's not many fresh faces that you tend to see. And that's the real issue. Like, who have New Japan got now? And maybe now's not the right question, but who have they got that's going to bring in that person that they haven't seen before? And I'm sure you'll touch on it later, but maybe Tana's retirement show next year might be the window to flash some, you know, new faces around. Who knows? But that's their biggest challenge, I think, right now.
Yeah. And before I get to the question, I'll just say I do think, like you mentioned, I do think this is going to be overall a good thing for the health of Naito. And I do find it interesting because, you know, from our perspective, at least from my perspective, it kind of seemed like, you know, maybe this guy wanted to keep this schedule up and not realize his body was breaking down. But when you start reading like some of the reports that we had in our newsletter this week and other reports, it does seem like he kind of knows, yeah, my body is breaking down. I'm doing all these tours. I'm doing all these multi-mans. I'm doing, you know, all these big matches. I'm doing G1s, and the pay is going down and my body's breaking down. And so it does seem like he kind of knows about the state of his health. And that's why I think that what's coming up next for him is going to be more of a, like you mentioned, Josh, a big match kind of deal. Like he does a one-off, maybe he'll face off against Ozawa in Noah, and then go face Marufuji, or go face Kiyomiya, or all these guys that he's never really faced before. Kento Miyahara, go over to All Japan. Like, there's all these big matches for him and all these other smaller promotions where he can probably get a really great one-off payday to do one big match, and then not have to do, come back the next day and do a 10-man tag. He can wait, maybe have some time in between these big matches.
I think that is the reality of it. I see what you're saying, Fraser, when you say that it could be a situation where when he says I'm done, how many wrestlers that actually say when I'm done, stay done? Like, they never do. I think that the allure of the ring, unless it's a situation like a Stone Cold where like you're gonna die, unless they tell him he's gonna die, I think he's just gonna keep wrestling, because that's what all wrestlers do. I could be wrong, but I've watched wrestling for too many years to ever believe any wrestler who ever says that they're going to totally stay done. Ric Flair wrestled a couple years ago. Like, I think this guy's gonna do produce shows. I think he's gonna work big matches, and I think he's gonna work Tokyo Domes. That's just me personally, especially with, and maybe I'm wrong, but you know what? New Japan is counting on it, because look at how delicately and specifically worded their announcement of his departure was. The words that they used in the Jeff Cobb and the Bushi one was that they said like that I forget what the exact verbiage was, but it was something along the lines of like, they are no longer with us, or they've departed, or they've like chosen to leave. But with this one, it's like, we were unable to come to terms, but we are separating on the best terms possible. Like, they want this man to work a fucking Tokyo Dome.
If I can just say one thing, maybe apologies, it probably wasn't clear enough. When I said what Naito was referring to in the past, it was always about going to dad status. I'm not saying he's not going to wrestle, but I meant that he wasn't going to join Kojima and Tenzan and company and sort of be in that space. That's what I meant. And then secondly, just last point I would just make, talking to Naito's popularity, another tangible point, which I think most of your listeners will already know, is that Dontaku tickets were selling relatively slowly up until the announcement on the 3rd and the 4th of May, which is Golden Week, which is like the kind of almost like the Christmas in Japan. Like, Japan has a lot of public holidays, but they all tend to be just one day at a time. And then this truly Golden Week comes along, which everybody has a lot of time off on, which ironically is not always the best time to travel, because Japanese companies are super strict, and that's the only time you can really travel. So typically I don't go to Dontaku, but as soon as I heard the news, and when I said typically, I've never been to Dontaku actually, but when I heard the news, I was like, straight on the website, bang, buy tickets May 3, May 4. And I think May 4 had gone from about, I don't know, half, 2/3 full for a big show. It's quite a decent sized building for Quokka, to being sold out the very next day because of Naito. I haven't checked where May 3 is, but again, it just shows what a draw he is. So those are my final 2 cents on that.